Hello there. Hope you're well today. In this lecture, we're going to look at several events that took place the night that Jesus was betrayed and then the next day. So this would be Thursday night and Friday morning, according to the gospel chronology. We have already talked about in our last lecture the disciples' visit to the garden on the side of the Mount of Olives and Jesus's arrest by the party that was brought by Judas Iscariot. And we also talked about Jesus being taken to Annas, and then the first part of the denial of Peter. And so we're going to pick up then at chapter 18, verse 19, where we read about the actual questioning of Jesus that took place when he was brought to Annas. So let's look at that passage now. The structure of this passage is as follows. Verse 19 describes or states that Jesus was questioned by Annas, and then the reply of Jesus is given in the next two verses. That reply of Jesus caused a nearby soldier to strike Jesus on the face and to rebuke him harshly. And then, of course, in verse 23, we read Jesus's response to the soldier and what he did. And then in the last verse, we read that Annas, after hearing Jesus, then sends him on to Caiaphas. And so that's the basic structure of this rather short passage. Let's look at some observations. The interrogation of Jesus by Annas is unique to the fourth gospel. Nothing is said about Annas in the synoptic gospels, and certainly nothing is said about Jesus being taken first to Annas before he was taken to the reigning high priest, who was Caiaphas. So this is an account that you won't find in the synoptic gospels. Now, Annas is actually called the high priest in verse 19. When it says, then the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching, this has to be a reference to Annas, because down in verse 24, we read that Annas then sent Jesus bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So in the Gospel of John, Annas is called the high priest, and so is Caiaphas. Apparently, Annas is still called the high priest as an honorary gesture. We might today say something like high priest emeritus, but apparently he still does have some power. Otherwise, it's hard to understand why Jesus would be first taken to Annas. When we read in verse 24 that Annas sent Jesus bound to Caiaphas, the high priest, they are probably taking Jesus from one area in the palace of the high priest to another area. Probably not moving Jesus from one place to another, that is, not from one palace to another palace, but probably one part of the palace of the high priest to another part of that palace. So this would not be a very long way for Jesus to go when he leaves Annas and goes to Caiaphas. The encounter that Jesus has with the high priest is very brief in the Gospel of John. We don't hear anything about the response of Annas to what Jesus said to the soldier. So it's a very brief account, but as you can see, this hearing does not go very well. And then Jesus is taken on to Caiaphas for an examination. Now then, the next pericope that we're going to look at is a very short one. It's Peter's denial of Jesus, part 2. And so now we will hear about the second and third denial of Peter. The structure is very simple. Peter's second denial is described in verse 25. His third denial is described in the next 2 verses, 66 and 67. Now, one thing that is unique to the Gospel of John is that Peter's third denial, we are told, was given to a relative of Malchus. Now, Malchus is the man whose ear Peter had just sliced off when the soldiers came to arrest Jesus in the garden. And this is a detail in the Gospel of John that's not found in the Synoptic Gospels. In fact, in the Synoptic Gospels, we don't know the name of the man who lost his ear. In the Gospel of John, we are specifically told that it was a man named Malchus, who was a slave of the high priest. And so there's interesting little details that are found here in the fourth Gospel that are not found in the Synoptic Gospels. The denials of Peter obviously fulfill Jesus's prophecy spoken earlier in chapter 13, verse 38. You remember that Peter vowed his loyalty to Jesus, and Jesus told him that before that very night was over, Peter would deny him 3 times. And so just as Jesus said it would happen, so it did happen. So another reference to Jesus's knowledge of the future and his ability to correctly prophesy. Now then, let's go to the next pericope, Jesus's trial before Pontius Pilate. And this is found in verses 28 through 40. The structure of this passage is like this. First of all, Jesus was taken from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters called the Praetorium. That is described in verse 28, the transference of Jesus from the palace of the high priest to the headquarters of Pilate, which are also in the city of Jerusalem, but in a different location of the city of Jerusalem. Then we have in verses 29 through 32 an exchange between Pilate and the Jews who bring Jesus to him for trial. And then verses 33 through 38a, we have Pilate directly questioning Jesus. And then in verses 38b through 40, we have the offer that Pilate makes to the Jews to release Jesus in accord with a Passover custom of the Romans. So that's how this passage breaks down. Now then, some observations. It's really striking that in the Gospel of John, we know that Jesus was taken to Caiaphas, taken from Annas to Caiaphas for an interview or questioning or whatever, but the fourth Gospel tells us absolutely nothing about what happened when Jesus went before Caiaphas. Now, that's a great contrast to the Synoptic Gospels, because in the Synoptic Gospels, there is nothing said about Jesus going to Annas, but there's a great deal of detail given about Jesus being taken before Caiaphas, and apparently also in front of the whole Jewish court, the Sanhedrin. And so there's a good deal of detail there in the Synoptic Gospels about that, and about Jesus being found guilty of blasphemy before Caiaphas and the court. But in the Gospel of John, there is just nothing except that Jesus did go before Caiaphas. So that's a striking difference between the Gospel of John and the Synoptic Gospels. Now, the praetorium of Pilate, its location is not totally known. The traditional spot for the location of the praetorium was at a structure called the Tower of Antonia. And I'll show you a map in just a second. You can see where that was located. But there are quite a number of modern scholars who think that the praetorium may have not been there, but rather have been at the palace of Herod I. Now, Herod I was no longer living at this time, of course, but so this was the palace that he had used earlier when he was alive. And so I'll show you now the two locations in the city of Jerusalem. I'm sorry that when I expanded this map, it made the labels a little bit fuzzy, but I think you can still see the Tower of Antonia, the Antonia Fortress it's called. And I don't know if you can see my cursor or not. I hope that you can, but at any rate, you can see the temple complex here, a large rectangular structure on the east side, the right side of the city of Jerusalem, and the temple itself, the actual temple building, is in yellow. Well, just on the northwest corner of the temple complex, this is where the Antonia Fortress was located. And this is the traditional spot for Pilate's praetorium. So if you go to Jerusalem today and you want to be involved in Holy Week celebrations, then the march from Pilate's residence to, to the place where Jesus was crucified, that march would begin in the general vicinity of the Antonia Fortress. The fortress is no longer there today, but the pilgrims gather at a spot near where it was and then walk to the place where the traditional spot where Jesus was crucified. The other possible location for the praetorium is over here on the west side, the left side of the city. And you can see it clearly marked as Herod's palace. And so those are the two possible locations for Herod's praetorium. Either way, they're both within the city of Jerusalem. Now, one of the things about this particular pericope that is so striking is the irony in the Gospel of John that the Jews do not want to enter into the praetorium because they're worried that they will become ritually defiled by entering the residence of a non-Jew. And so they don't want to go into the praetorium. Pilate has to come out to the Jewish representatives to meet with them because they don't want to go in the praetorium. They're afraid of ritual defilement. But what is so strikingly ironic is that the Jews are worried about ritual defilement as they're bringing their Messiah, the Son of God, to be crucified. And so when you think about those two things together, it's incredibly shocking that they do not see and do not realize that the way they are treating Jesus is the real defilement. And they need not be concerned about these ritual matters of defilement when they are actually involved in handing over the Son of God to be crucified. Now, I want you to look at verse 28 just for a moment. This is the verse I just referred to. It says that the Jews did not want to enter Pilate's headquarters, his praetorium, so as to avoid ritual defilement and to be able to eat the Passover. This verse, along with several others that I've listed on the PowerPoint, strongly suggests that the Passover fell on Friday, the year that Jesus died. All of the Gospels are united in their portrayal of the crucifixion of Jesus on Friday. The Gospel of John seems to suggest that it was on this Friday that Passover fell. Now, if that's the case, then look what it means. It means that just as the lambs were being killed inside the city of Jerusalem, that would have taken place in the temple, just as they were being killed inside the city of Jerusalem on Friday afternoon, in order to be eaten at Passover that Friday evening, that the Lamb of God was being killed just outside the city walls. So remember that it is in this gospel, and only in this gospel, that Jesus is twice described as the Lamb of God. Furthermore, when his bones are not broken by the soldiers, we are told in this gospel that this was a fulfillment of the passage in the Old Testament that says that the lambs of the Passover lamb must not be broken. So in the Gospel of John, we seem to have a very dramatic depiction of Jesus, the Lamb of God, the true Lamb of God, the Lamb of God to whom all literal lambs pointed, was being killed, being slaughtered outside the city of Jerusalem at precisely the same time that the lambs were being killed that Friday afternoon in the temple. What a dramatic depiction. Now, verse 31, look at that verse just for a moment. Pilate said to the Jews, "You take Jesus yourselves and judge him according to your law." Pilate seems to be put out by the fact that he's even asked to try to settle one of their issues. But the Jews replied, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." And this provides the explanation for why the high priest and the Jewish court had to take Jesus to Pilate. If they wanted Jesus executed, that was something that the Romans would not allow them to do. And therefore, if Jesus was going to be executed, he would have to be found guilty by the Roman governor, the Roman prefect. And so that is why they take Jesus to Pontius Pilate. Now, the Romans normally crucified political rebels. Of course, that's not the way the Jews carried out capital punishment back when they were permitted to do it. They carried out capital punishment by stoning. But not so the Romans. They crucified political rebels. And so the fact that Jesus was taken to Pilate for trial and that he would be found guilty by Pilate of political rebellion meant that he would be crucified, not stoned. And so this is the meaning of verse 32. If you'll look at verse 32 of chapter 18, the evangelist specifically tells us that the fact that Jesus was killed, executed by the Romans, fulfilled what Jesus had said when he had indicated the kind of death that he was to die. If you go back to chapter 12, verses 32 and 33, Jesus, in describing his death, described himself as being lifted up. And that is literally what happened when Jesus was crucified. He was lifted up from the earth on the cross. And so therefore, the fact that the Romans would execute Jesus by crucifixion, this fit exactly with what Jesus had earlier said, that he would be lifted up in his death. Now, Pilate's questions, as he questions Jesus, they focus on Jesus's kingship. And that word is used several times in this brief description. Now, Jesus does acknowledge his kingship. He clearly says, my kingdom. He has a kingdom. He is a king. So Jesus does acknowledge his kingship, but he qualifies it. He qualifies it in two ways. He says that his kingdom is not of this world. If it were, he says, his disciples would fight for him. And also Jesus qualifies his kingship by saying that his purpose in the world is to testify to the truth, to witness to the truth, verses 36 through 38. So Jesus is a king, but he is not the kind of king that Pilate thinks that perhaps he is. And but he's not a king like human kings are, and so therefore he doesn't act in those ways. He most certainly is a king. That's not to be doubted. But his kingship and his kingdom are very different from how people normally think of human kings and human kingdoms. Now, when Jesus says that he came into the world to testify to the truth, Pilate asked his famous question, what is truth? How ironic that is, because according to the fourth gospel, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And here, as Pilate gazes at Jesus, with the truth standing before him, Pilate asks the question, what is truth? Highly ironic. All right. Now, one other thing that is pointed out in this pericope quite clearly is that Pilate knows that Jesus is not guilty of an attempt to overthrow the Roman government. After he has his conversation with Jesus, and after Jesus qualifies the nature of his kingship, Pilate comes back out to the Jews and says, I find no case against him. Now, Pilate does something or offers something which is perhaps in some ways surprising. Apparently, there was a custom at Passover time for the Roman government to allow the Jewish people to choose one prisoner, one Jewish prisoner, and to release that prisoner to the people as an act of Rome's mercy. And so apparently that's something that had happened previously, and it was more or less a custom. Pilate offers to release Jesus as the prisoner to be released that year. Perhaps we're not told why, but perhaps it's because Pilate really did not think that Jesus was had done anything to be worthy of execution. Perhaps it's also because Pilate would rather release Jesus, who doesn't seem to present a political threat. He'd rather release Jesus than someone who really did represent a political threat to Rome. And it's really interesting that when Pilate offers to release Jesus, the Jews, however, demand another man, Barabbas, who is described not only in the Gospel of John, but in the other Gospels as well, as a violent brigand, that is, a violent revolutionary. And so it's not that surprising that Pilate would rather hand over Jesus than somebody like Barabbas, but the crowd demands the release of Barabbas. One final thing here that is ironic. I don't know, it's hard to know whether the evangelist thought of it in this way or not, but the name Barabbas is really not a proper name, a proper Jewish name. It is a nickname, and it's made up of two Aramaic words, Bar and Abbas, and it means son of Abba. And the word Abba means father. So here we have this man whose nickname is Son of the Father, who is being released, and the true Son of the Father, that is God, is being crucified. There's pretty heavy irony in that fact. So the offer that Pilate makes to release Jesus is rebuffed by the Jews, who demand Barabbas. Well, that's all that we have in this lecture, and I will see you soon. Goodbye.